I call David Clendon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Kia ora koutou. Mr Speaker, I'm pleased to take a call on this bill. It's been interesting both in the previous reading and in the committee stages earlier today. That to the extent to which those conversations reveal this peculiar sort of love-hate relationship we have with motor vehicles in this country. Probably not unique to us, but certainly a characteristic and another reason why this market does need to have some regulation, some attention paid to it. It's not a market that's been characterised with a high level of integrity, it has to say, at the lower end of the market. Clearly new car sellers, franchise holders, and for the most part second car dealers are people who operate with some degree of integrity. But there is a minority whose reputation probably equates somewhere with those of us politicians, and it's not a particularly high level of trust that's shown by the public in that market. So it's important that we are seen to apply consumer protection provisions into this. Given the economic and apparently the cultural importance of motor vehicles in New Zealand, I think it is probably unfortunate and a bit odd that this bill has languished for nearly 18 months since its first reading. And I was interested in the previous speaker's, Leanne Dalziel's comments about the necessity perhaps of looking at a more regular review, a more timely review of what is quite a significant market. The numbers are interesting. There's something over 4 million vehicles currently registered in New Zealand. Looking at the population, it's roughly one each, which puts us certainly in the top tier in terms of per capita ownership of vehicles. That number is also fairly stable. The number of new vehicles coming on the market more or less balances those that get trashed each year. And it's interesting that we do seem to maintain this very, very high level of vehicle ownership, despite the fact that clearly vehicles are a liability. Often they're perceived as being an asset, but clearly they are a liability to own and operate. New vehicle sales hit a peak in 2007, something like 100,000 vehicles in that year, newly registered, which dropped substantially in the recession down to a low last year of fewer than 70-odd thousand vehicles. But clearly that figure is on the way up. There's something like a 15% increase in new vehicle sales this year and something like 43% increase in the sale of imported second-hand vehicles. And again, it just reflects the need for some attention and some constant attention, I guess, to regulate, ensure that consumers are getting a good deal in this market. The most popular vehicle segment in New Zealand is in medium and mini and small vehicles, but there have been major drops in the sales as more people are thinking very hard about purchasing of large investments like cars. And of course, collapse of the finance companies also discouraged numbers of people from getting involved in anything that committed them to debt. It's interesting that the largest or the hardest hit segment of the market is in large cars. People are going away from large sedans more towards SUVs, despite the fact that the particular qualities or characteristics of those vehicles actually are really only meeting the needs of a relatively small number of people. And again, all of this information does lead us to reflect and to acknowledge that purchase of a motor vehicle is often a very emotive rather than a wholly rational decision. There may be a degree of rationality about it, but people often buy on quite irrational basis. And in a market like that, again, it is quite important that we have appropriate regulation, and without wishing to sound patronising, that we do apply some protection to consumers in an area where they're very easily ripped off and cheated. The age of the New Zealand vehicle fleet is hovering about 12, 13 years, particularly the light vehicle fleet, which is the largest component of the overall fleet, about 90% of the total, and about half of that fleet is made up of used imports, vehicles that have come in as second-hand vehicles. And something like 78% of total vehicle kilometres travelled in New Zealand are in that light passenger vehicle category, which indicates that most of the kilometres travelled in New Zealand are in fact in cars and the very light commercials. And all of those numbers again tell us that the buying and selling of vehicles is a very busy, it's a very complex market, and any steps towards better informing and protecting consumers in that marketplace are to be welcomed, and there are clearly provisions in this bill that seek to do that. The numbers also point to the need for developing much more coherent and much more appropriate strategies for incentivising customers to make purchases that will meet their needs, and it will reduce the adverse environmental impact of the motor vehicle use. And the Greens over time have put up a number of propositions aimed at increasing, in particular, fuel efficiency standards across the whole vehicle fleet. We've proposed a system of tradable credits which would give importers absolute discretion in terms of what vehicles they choose to import, but clearly that would incentivise a mix that favours the most fuel-efficient vehicles coming into this country, which would not only meet the needs of consumers to the extent it would reduce the overall running cost of vehicles, but would also reduce the significant negative environmental impact of our vehicle use. We've proposed fee baits, that is to say, differentials in registration fees, again to advantage and to incentivise the purchase and use of smaller, more efficient, more fuel-efficient vehicles rather than the larger, less fuel-efficient vehicles, giving consumers maximum information, maximum choice, so that they can reduce their overall cost of ownership of vehicles over time. It's true that this reform, this amendment to the bill, will provide more consumer protection, and it has been pointed out that the internet is not a new phenomenon, but certainly the numbers of vehicles which are bought and sold on internet sales, on auctions, may make up a significant part of the whole. When I checked a few days ago, there was something like 32,000 motor vehicles advertised for sale on the web, mostly on Trade Me. Some 25,000 of those were private sales. So again, it points towards the need for ensuring that private or indeed commercial sellers are obliged to give consumers as appropriate, accurate and honest information about what it is they're buying into. So we will be supporting this bill. It does enhance the degree and increase the degree of consumer protection. We do regret that there isn't a much more fundamental and a much more coherent and broad-based attention paid to how we buy, sell, how we incentivise the importing, the purchasing patterns of motor vehicles in New Zealand, and we'll continue to advocate for an approach that does lead us to a more sustainable, a low-carbon economy, which is the way we need to go. Thank you.